All right, and we're back. We're back from a bit of a break, guys. It's COMP1073, and it's week 8, part 1 of our broadcast. We were gone from, for a bit, just for a break. And again, I was saying to some people that were here earlier that I only see you guys once a week, which kind of sucks for me because I can only kind of, have discussions with you once a week. I do have office hours, however, on Fridays, usually after class, or after 12 o'clock, between 12 and 2. I can probably do an office hour somewhere in between there if you need to see me. But otherwise, or I can always, communicate with you or connect with you on Hangouts or Skype or something like that. So if you wanted to do a Hangouts or Skype, and if you had a problem you want me to help you with, I can certainly connect with you through that. Just mentioning that as we go forward with some of the stuff we're going to be doing. Okay, so we did our exam, and for the most part, the stuff that I saw was okay. Some people had trouble with GitHub and Azure. That was kind of an issue. And again, I mean, maximum marks you would have lost there is if you did both, you couldn't do both, you would have lost 8 marks on your exam. Because I was giving you 4 marks for GitHub and 4 marks for Azure. Most of you got at least 2 marks for Azure, for GitHub. Some people did it last minute. That's not how GitHub is used. We don't use, put GitHub up, in the last minute and use it as a backup. We use it for as we go. As we develop, typically, in the web world, we use GitHub as version control. So as we continue, we put up a milestone, we do something, a new feature. Every time we put up a feature, we put up, we kind of put a commit up to GitHub. That's how we usually do it. Okay. So that's my expectation. So if you didn't do that for your exam, or if you didn't do that for your assignment 1, 2, or even if for this next one, the third one, then you're going to have a bit of a problem in terms of the GitHub mark. Azure, does it work? Did you put it up on Azure? Do you have a link for Azure? Yes. If you made the link for Azure, but it doesn't work, you still get 2 marks. Right? See, I'm still giving you that. So I'm saying even if it doesn't work for Azure, well, you made the link. I can see the link. It goes there and it says site not accessible or forbidden or something weird, or you have errors. When it comes and when it pulls up, you still get 2 marks if it's up on Azure. If it works and everything goes well, then you get your full 4 marks on Azure. Right? If you did your continuous deployment and all that stuff. So just keep that in mind. Let's take a look at assignment 3. I've kind of posted it right now, and I want to kind of go over what it is before we begin everything else, because today's class and next week's class are going to all be around data, right? And how we deal with data, things like JavaScript object notation, JavaScript objects, and the difference between JavaScript object notation and JavaScript objects. There's 2 different things here, right? We'll talk about those today. I'm going to be looking at this assignment for the next one. It's going to be based off your portfolio thing again, right? So you're going to just modify what you had before. So let's take a look at that. This is up on Blackboard. So again, assignment 3, your mini portfolio JSON data now, right? And all you're going to do is do by week 10. So I'm giving you a couple weeks now. And the reason why I'm giving you a couple weeks is because some of this is a little tricky if you don't know how to do it. And sometimes, we only see each other once a week, right? So if you have a problem, and if I make it due next week, which really it's only a week-long assignment, you probably polish this off within a week or so. But if you have a problem, I can't answer you until it's done, until it's due, which would be really bad. Like if I made it due next Friday, that means next Thursday when we get together, like you have a half a day before it's due, right? It's not cool. And I want to give you a little bit more time because I want to talk about JSON data over a couple of weeks in order for you guys to be ready, right? Okay, so what is this thing? What am I talking about? What is JSON data? So you're going to extend your mini portfolio assignment from a 1 and 2, and you're going to write your JavaScript code to read your paragraph data from a JSON file, as opposed to having it hard-coded inside your HTML, right? That's pretty poor, right? Imagine you have like a string file, and then you have all your data assigned to strings or an array or something, and it's inside your code. It's almost like better just to write it into an HTML document, right? Which doesn't make sense. But what we normally do is we get our data from a JSON source, a text, some kind of data source, as an example. Maybe it's a database, right? Whatever. So what JSON data allows us to do, and we're going to talk about what that is today, it allows us to get data from, populated in a certain format. We can read it into a data object, and we can use the data object to, from a data storage perspective, to read it from a file and then, or from a website, and then push it to our view, our HTML document. That's what I want to do. So that's what this is all about. Otherwise, if you know how to use some basic data structures like arrays and strings, which is what we did for assignment 1, all you're doing. So assignment 1, all it was, can I take my array or my string and, whatever I populate on my string, it goes to the document. Assignment 2 was, can I read from my document and pump it out to the console, right? Assignment 3 is, can I read from a text file or JSON file, and then from that JSON file, populate my data into an array, and then from there, spit it out into the HTML document. That's assignment number 3. That's what it's all about. All right? Now, these are all worth like 5%. They're little assignments to get you guys warmed up with JavaScript and JSON and all this kind of stuff, right? All right, so this is what the instructions are. So part 1, this is the only real work you have to do here in part 1. The rest, part 2, is just make sure your structure is the same as it was before, that you still include internal documentation and so on, and that you populate it up to GitHub and Azure. So that part, if you just were to take your assignment 2, you've got the marks for internal documentation. Some of them for internal documentation, and your structure is almost totally there, and so on. There's going to be some additional files you need to put in for your JSON data, but otherwise it's identical. But here's the meat and bones of this assignment. So create a function that uses AJAX to read a JSON file. So we haven't talked about what AJAX is. Talk about that a little bit today, and how we read data from a JSON file. And then this contains all your paragraph data that you need for your mini portfolio site, right? So that's where the data is going to come from now. Instead of coming from your JavaScript page, it's going to come from a file, right? That's what we're going to do. And the data that is retrieved from the JSON file should be stored in an array data structure. So I'm forcing you to store it in an array this time around, right? So I'm kind of getting you to use, thank you, sir. I'm getting you to use the array data structure, because if I don't force you to use the array, you won't use the array, thanks. Right? So I'm making you use the array this time around, because the array is a very common structure, and I want you guys to kind of learn how to do that. C is populate the pages of your mini portfolio site with the data, right? So each piece has a few marks that you're going to be assigned. At the end of the day, even though it's worth 30 points, the majority of this thing is in section 1. That's where I'm going to be really judging you. So again, it shouldn't be that difficult in terms of getting this done. Is if you follow the class, the demos that we're going to do in class, I'm probably going to also have a little bit of a lab that's probably going to be due next week, right? That we're going to do. So if you follow those things, your assignment 3 should be no problem. Okay. Questions around assignment 3 and what's required, and if you understand what I mean by reading the file, reading data from the file, right? Because right now all we've been doing is we have data that's inside of a string variable or something like that. It just always seems that this room is like next to something that's rolling around. Yes, Margaret.
So you said is the array data structure, is that what we did in assignment?
Well, in assignment 1, we talked, or actually near in the beginning, we talked about 1 as arrays, right? When you declare a new array, and there's different ways of doing that, which we're going to talk about today, right? So we're going to go over that whole piece again, right? But this is just a container. So the array is a type of container. Remember that it holds multiple cells, right? That's what it's going to be. And each cell or element in the array it can be thought about as a variable, right? That's what it is, right? So an array is just a collection of different data variables, if you will, right, inside, and it can have different with the array, right? But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to load up our data into an array, and each paragraph, because paragraphs are really just string, right? They're going to be represented inside of our array. So the only thing you're going to load up is one piece of data from each of your each part of your JSON file. And we'll talk about that in a second.
So, but that data structure is what we had in our JS file.
Yes, you would create this data structure, the array. You would create that in your JavaScript file, and then all you do is you read everything from your JSON, your text file, or your JSON file, and you would populate your array with that data. Right? And we will talk about that.
I missed the beginning. We were talking about the assignments. Are you going to provide us with a corrected version of assignment 1?
Oh, you're talking about like a solution set?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can do that. I will do that. I haven't done it, but I will. So to see what I'm expecting you're talking about.
Well, I don't know if I went wrong.
You probably didn't. I mean, if you did, did it work, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so the question is, how do I know if I did well? And the answer is, if it worked, if you met my requirements and you did it, beyond the UI marks where I might look at it and go, oh, okay, this could have been aligned a little differently or something like that. And we're talking about like half a mark to a mark.
Yeah,
there.
I'm not worried about marks. It's the best way to do it.
Well, we haven't.
My way was pretty crappy.
Well, no, we haven't talked about the best way to do it yet.
Okay.
There is no best way, by the way. JavaScript is all around experience, right? Coding. So if you're not a good programmer, even if you've learned how to code in JavaScript, your best way is not going to be the best way. It will never be the best way until you are more experienced, right? So I can't expect for you guys to do anything but brute force. Like I'm talking about like the bare basics to make it work, right? And that'll be miles ahead of other people when you first start off. Once we start talking about you know, optimizing your code and your structure and all that stuff, that's later on. And this is kind of an intro to JavaScript. And maybe for some of you, an intro to programming, right? Because some people aren't really programmers in this course, right? So that's where, you know, I would say that I'm not going to be so hard on you guys for structure, right? It doesn't make any sense. Okay, any other questions around the assignment 3? All right, so that's really assignment 3 in a nutshell. We're going to talk about this today, and what I'm going to recommend to you is I've got this PowerPoint presentation that I put up week 6, and I put it up there early so you guys can have a chance to take a look at it. It's called Communicating with the Server Through Ajax, right? So again, if you can pull this one up, it's a PowerPoint presentation that's in PDF format that I'm going to be looking at today, right? Even though it says Lesson 6 Part 1, it's part of the stuff that I talked about, that I'm going to be talking about today. So we're going to be talking about something called Ajax, right? And what Ajax is. And this is kind of straight from the book. So Ajax is really the ability for us to communicate asynchronously with the server. Wow, asynchronously. And one of the things to understand when it comes to Ajax is the ability for us to send and receive requests. And one of the things that I don't like about this book is it doesn't really give you any kind of really cool diagrams about how that looks. So let's make one. Right, let's do it here, you know, as on the fly. We'll just kind of create a little diagram for us, almost like I'm drawing on the board. All right, so bear with me while I do that. All right, so I'm going to pull up one of my favorite programs, Fireworks, because again, lightweight and so on. We've talked about this before. I'm going to make a new kind of file here. We're going to call it, you know, make it 640 by 480. So this gives me enough room to draw, just like I'm drawing on the blackboard or whiteboard. And let's make the background white for our example here. Here we go. Okay, so there's our little whiteboard. And I want to talk about request response, right? So what I have is, I have the client. And let's say, for example, you sit here, you've got your little computer, and that's not red. That's a red computer. I want a red computer. I want a computer that has a little outside. This is your computer here, and this is, you know, kind of make it so it's, you know, kind of wider. There we go. Your computer, and this is your laptop or tablet or whatever. And you want to access a website, right? So your computer's here, and you have to get the website. How do you communicate? How do you get a web page in the first place? Do you remember? It's kind of it's a very interesting step that we take, right? We go on the browser, and the browser is actually a client piece of software that allows us to communicate with the server, a web server. That's what it does. I know this is kind of, you might say, Tom, we know this stuff, right? Let's talk about this. So the server it exists somewhere on the cloud. So let me just, you know, imagine if this is the server and it's on the cloud somewhere, right? Here's my computer, I'm communicating with the server. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send a request. So it's going to go from here, right? I'm going to send a request that goes to the server, right? Let's look at this jagged line I got going on. So the request goes to the server, and this is the request that goes from the client to the server. Let's type that in so you guys can see this. And by the way, this is being recorded, so if you don't remember, don't worry. Client, oh, it's red too. Hey. And I'll do another one over here on this side, and I'll say server. So there's a server. And the server is usually located, like, again, this could be your cloud provider. It could be Microsoft Azure. It could be Heroku. It could be whatever, DigitalOcean, whatever your cloud provider is or your server is. The client makes a connection with the browser to the server. The server, right, is going to return some data. But when the client does this little arrow here, this little arrow for the client is what we call a request, right? So here's a request, right? So the request goes up to the server and says, hey, server, I need some data, right? And the server, right, it says, okay, I see your request, right? Here's your data, and then it's going to draw. We're going to draw another line here that kind of goes back to this, right? And this is kind of a very simple way of thinking about it, but this is what really happens here, right? Our server responds with some data. Here's our data, and we're going to say response. Really, every time we go to a website, and when we go from one website to another, even if I have a, let's say for example, I have a little a nav bar, right? That's inside my browser. Why is it coming up red? If I have a little nav bar that's in my browser, right, as an example, this little nav bar is going to communicate, and maybe I have different links on the nav bar. It's going to go, every time I click on a link, it's going to go to the server, grab the information, and then, you know, kind of re-render the page. Each page that is rendered, right, in HTML, when I say rendered, I mean drawn to the screen with all of its text and everything else, comes from the server. The server houses all the data, right? That's where all your pages sit, right? And that's what we've been doing so far. So client goes out, sends a request to the server, and it comes back with a response. Okay, this is your web server, and I think I should specify that. And the web server typically serves up HTML type pages, all right? So flat web, pages. So your web server is only HTML. That means if you want to get a web page itself, the view, that's where the server, that's what happens to the server. But the server typically also has a data store. And the data store is in the form of a database or something else. It also is going to go and respond with the data. Usually, for example, if you want to load up some information, like you want to set up a list of addresses for all your clients, right? The list of addresses is going to be stored on the server in the form of a database somewhere, right? Could be that this is your web server, but you might have another data store somewhere else, right? So, for example, let's just move this up. I'll do that. Let's just communicate with all this stuff. And we'll just select all that stuff. And we'll move all this stuff up. Or, you can see that I need coffee this morning. Okay, so if I move this stuff up to the server, here's my server. And what I want to do is I have my server, but I also have, right, another server down here. Instead of it being a web server, this one here is some kind of data store, right? Like, for example, I have a database server, so DB server. Right. So what happens is, sometimes what happens is I send stuff out to my web server, it returns some response, and then what happens is my websites and everything else, stuff that's inside my server, communicates with my data store somewhere. Let's make this data store a little bit smaller so we can kind of deal with it a little nicer. So I'm going to kind of click on this thing and resize this little box to make it so we can fit on the screen. So the database server, it's kind of off to the side, kind of thing. And what's going to happen is you're going to get this almost like a request that goes out from the web server typically, right, to your database server. Oh, I'm not even drawing properly today. Here's your database server. So it's going to go this way. And then what's happening is the data is going to come back to your web server, right? This is what happens. And then from there, after it makes it's going to have a request response here as well. It's going to come back, and the response is going to be in the form of re-rendering your page. Typically, this is the way it works in a standard scenario, right? Notice that we don't have a model view controller kind of layout here. Everything happens at the web server. The logic, the rendering of the page, the way it handles your data and how it connects with the database, all that stuff's handled on the server side. Okay. So when people talk about being a web developer, right, and they talk about being front end or back end, a front end developer normally deals with stuff that's rendered here on the client, and the back end developer, when they used to exist, now there's no, nowadays it's like, being a back end developer and a front end. The front-end people are more designers now than anything else. People who can, look at the layout and understand color and composition and so on, how the page looks. They take care of the user experience and all that kind of stuff, right? And the back-end people are really the developers these days that take care of things like how the web server communicates with the database and how what's the behavior of your application. That's what they kind of deal with more than anything else, as opposed to the look and feel and the user experience the application is giving to the user. So knowing this, right, Ajax, the way it would work is every time I wanted to update something on the page, like for example, let's say I have this little thumbnail, right, that's sitting on the page, and I want to update. If I want to have some kind of like objects that are on the page that I want them to be updated. We've got some objects here on the page. If these objects, as an example, aren't on the page initially, and if I have to do something on this part of the page, right, through some kind of button or text object or whatever, to make these objects appear, every time I click on these things in a regular scenario, I'm going to make another request, there's going to be another response, and the page is going to be redrawn every time. That was the old way of doing things, right? With AJAX, we don't have to do that. With AJAX, this asynchronous methodology of us communicating with the server and the client, it can happen so that we don't re-render the entire page, just the parts of the page that we want to update. Okay, AJAX. And that creates this idea of a rich client experience, right? Rich internet experience, as opposed to, or dynamic web page, dynamic HTML, if you will, as opposed to static pages that have to just be re-rendered. So the whole page won't be re-rendered if you use AJAX, only that part that you need. That's why we use AJAX. And remember, AJAX is also able to communicate with the server from a data perspective. It's able to grab data and populate the page, you know, through an AJAX call, through a data call, if you will. We're going to open up a file, open up a connection, and the connection is going to come back with some data. That's what AJAX allows us to do. Questions around this whole idea, the idea that the client itself makes a request to the server and gets a response. In fact, as we go forward, when we do things more that are more intense, if you guys do server-side scripting, which is coming up for you, I'm not sure if it's next semester or the semester after, right, in this program, but server-side scripting does a lot more with request response, right? So understanding request response, it's good to start understanding it or try and look at it now when we start talking about JavaScript. Because remember, JavaScript we're dealing with right now is only on the front end. It's only happening on the client. We're writing it on the client, and it's happening, you know, we're getting some behavior that's going on. So we're using AJAX, which is written on the client side, to deal with getting data from the back end, right? Typically, when we want to deal with data, it's all back-end technologies. And the traditional technologies we used to use before on the server are things like PHP, right? PHP is something we used to have on the server. And PHP is a scripting language that handles the server-side requests, right? So I send a request to the server side. Our PHP scripts lives on the server. It deals with the request, processes the request, and then returns a response based on what the data they get in from the database server. So the PHP, that piece of code or whatever, acts almost like a controller. I'm going to put that in there. So PHP is almost like the controller that controls the logic, right, that comes back from the server side, right? That's what you normally have happening right now. And we can consider this piece of the whole mesh, this front end piece, the stuff that gets rendered on the page, right, on the client, right, as a view, right? So this is, if I was going to talk about this object, this is the view itself, right? So the view is the stuff that we're going to be seeing. So when I say the word view, I'm talking about how the page is rendered on the client, okay? When I want to create a new view, right, and this is new terminology for you, then you're going to see stuff that comes back from the server, usually from the controller. And then another thing that you can see from the controller is all about logic, right? So if I was going to talk about logic, the logic for how everything works, how it's processed on the back end, happens on the controller, right? Okay. The controller, though, doesn't just talk with the client, it also talks with the server. And in order for us to do that, we usually, on the server side, we usually have something else called a model, right? So here's the model. And the model really talks about our data model, right? This is all housed in the same kind of model and the same box here. So the box could be the same server that does both. But typically we have our model, and our model is things like this. How is our data structured? Like, for example, if I'm looking at address data, I'm looking for, as a person, I'm looking at people's information, like I'm home address, phone number, all that stuff. All those fields that we're talking about, that's our model, how our data is going to be structured in the database. But we house that information the way it's structured here on the server, right? And usually what happens is the controller uses the model, right, the structured methodology, to deal with the server and get a response back with structured data. It uses this data to render the page, the view. So it's almost like a three-tier architecture is what we've been using. And this whole structure, typically what we have nowadays, the most modern way of doing it is called MVC, which is model, view, and controller. All right, so the MVC structure kind of stuff in a very simplistic way that I've kind of outlined here. Model, view, controller. Okay? MVC. So model, view, controller says, well, I have my model. It's going to communicate with my database server. I'm going to get the data, the structure, back into the controller. The controller or the logic is going to house all my logic. It's going to process the information that I get from the request from the client. It's going to spit out or render the page with the data that I get from my server that's structured, so that the client gets what they're looking for. For example, if I do a search, I'm searching for a name in a database, right? I send the request out, the search request out to the server. The server says, oh, you're searching for an item of data in the database. Let me talk to the model. The model says, well, the data is structured this way. And by the way, the model also gives you an idea of how to communicate with the database server. It has certain methods or behaviors. For example, things like, hey, can I read? It can do the whole read. Who's ever heard of CRUD? You guys done any database at all? No database? You guys have done CRUD, right? Okay, so, sorry, say that again? Oh, great, so that's good. So, I mean, so it takes care of all the CRUD, the creation, reading, updating, and deletion of your data. That's what the model handles. It has methods or behaviors that deal with CRUD, creation, reading, updating, and deletion of your data, and communicates with the database server. Now, why am I saying all this stuff? Why is this important? And I don't want you guys to glaze when I talk about this stuff, but it's important to understand the way the whole system works. This is the whole ecosystem of the way websites kind of function, so to speak, right? In order for you to get what we're doing here with our PowerPoint presentation. So think what it says here. It says AJAX is a concept of refreshing a part of an HTML document without reloading the entire page. And that means is I'm not going to make an additional request to the server, right? Every time I make a request to the server, it takes time. Maybe it's going to be in times of milliseconds, like 300 milliseconds to go back and forth. That means like 1/3 of a second. If I keep doing that over and over again, it's going to be several seconds before you get your data. And sometimes we see that in some older applications, where the data takes a little bit of time, and it says there might be a little bit of a loading screen or some kind of like, loading animated GIF that comes up. Loading, 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 and then it's up, right? That whole loading process is sometimes the data or the requests going back and forth until it gets all the data from the server so they can render the view. All right. Microsoft actually originally did this back in 2000 when we did with this mail client, Web Access 2000, about 1999. And they came up with this idea of an XML HTTP request. Okay. XML, by the way, is, again, is another data format. There's two data formats primarily that we use with AJAX. Right? Actually, there's something else you can grab too. Here are the three things you can do with AJAX. I can load up an XML document, right? Or load up the data from an XML document, right? And I can interpret what that data is. I can load up straight HTML. So if I have an HTML page, I can load that data, into my document and re-render that onto the page if I want to. There's some bad things about that, right? And then the third thing is I can load up JSON data, right? Convert it from a string that I'm going to get into a JSON object or a JavaScript object, right? And then use that object inside my code. All right, so but Microsoft originally came up with this. And the thing is, IE5, back in the day, they used something called an ActiveX object. And even so, if you want to stay backwards compatible with IE, the older versions of IE, we still want to test to see if we have that kind of functionality in our current browser, right? So if I'm using the latest browsers, I don't need to check to see if I have, if I can do an XML HTTP request, right? Or so it's called. The short form of that is an XHR request, right? That's part of the AJAX. So there's two pieces of what I'm talking about here. How do I get my data? I'm using AJAX, right? What format my data is stored in. I talked about XML, maybe just plain HTML, and also JSON. Those are the three formats, data formats we're gonna be talking about today. Okay. So ActiveX was the way we did it, and even now, what we do is when we talk about ActiveX, and there's some information here about synchronous and asynchronous loading. We're going to talk about. I'm going to show you how this is done. When we do a synchronous request, what is a synchronous request? Does anyone understand understand what a synchronous request is? Difference between synchronous and asynchronous? I'm gonna have to ask you some questions, guys, or else it's gonna be, it's gonna be a straight download. I'm gonna talk to you guys and I'm just gonna tell you what it is, right? Synchronous request, it means that things happen one at a time. So I make a request, I wait for my response, right? So one request response. So in a synchronous world, all I'm gonna do is make one request to the server. I'm gonna wait until the server finishes processing, and then I get a response. I can't make another request until the response comes back. Synchronous. Why would this be bad? So imagine if I'm waiting. So when I say waiting, I mean wait. Like nothing gets rendered. Like there's nothing on the page. You're waiting until that server comes back with data, right? Slow, right? What about if I have multiple requests? And by the way, synchronous requests, if I was dealing with a synchronous server, by the way, that doesn't exist, but let's say I was. Let's say I had one server, my web server was synchronous. All of you were accessing my web page at the same time. When you make a request, I process the request on my server, send it back, but if you're making a request at the same time as you, as an example, 2 different people, you're gonna have to wait until his request is done before I give you your page. That's what it's like, right? That doesn't happen. By the way, it used to be that way. Way back in the day, originally it was just one request. It handled one request at a time. It did it very quickly, but it still was only one request at a time. Nowadays, we have multiple requests that can handle things asynchronously. And the way we do things asynchronously is we run each request as its own process. So we run things concurrently instead of running things consecutively, right? So I don't run things one at a time, one after the other. I'm running things all at the same time. As soon as I get another request, I create another process. I create another process. I can create as many processes as I want. And by the way, the more processes I have, is my server going to duplicate itself? Like, for example, if I'm Walmart and we're all shopping on Christmas, right? And I'm making thousands upon thousands of requests. What is the Walmart web server or web servers going to do? They're going to create additional processes, right, if you will, or threads, what they're like to be called, threads, for each request, right? Typically, this is the old style of doing things, right? So I'm going to create thousands of these requests because we're getting overloaded. And this is where they say, oh my God, my server got overloaded. I couldn't do my shopping online, and it's Christmas because it's peak season, and my server couldn't handle all the requests. That's what's happening, right? Because the server only has a capacity, and it has capacity based on its CPU, just like if you're going to buy a computer today. If you go buy a CPU, you're going to buy an i7 with 16 gigs of RAM maybe for your laptop. You're going to probably put an SSD now, at least with, I don't know, half a terabyte of SSD, 500 gigabytes at least, something like that. You're going to, kind of spec out your machine, right? Well, a server is just like that. It's just a machine that has certain specifications, right? But it can only handle so much. If I keep taxing it, if I have thousands of users accessing the data on the server, even if it's optimized to do such a thing, right? It won't matter. It's gonna stop, right? It's not gonna work properly anymore. It's gonna seem that it's not gonna function. In fact, if anything, you can even crash the server. You can have memory errors to the point where it doesn't work anymore. And the way they get around that nowadays is they have multiple servers, or they ramp up. They can, if you're using cloud computing, what you can do is you can throttle up the hardware as you require, right? So that's why cloud computing is becoming more and more popular. Instead of me purchasing additional servers, like physically investing capital in buying additional servers during Christmas, and then somehow selling them or getting rid of them later, or even leasing them, or whatever I'm going to do, I can just throttle up virtually through my web provider, and I can have as much power as I need, right, based on my thresholds. I can watch certain thresholds. For example, if my utilization goes beyond 60%, I bump up my power, right? That's way better than, okay, I don't know how much power I need, but I'm going to buy another server. Hopefully that'll work. That's a totally different way of doing things. So the way it works is synchronous in the past, just to clarify, synchronous does one request at a time. Think about it this way. If I call you on the phone, one more example. I call you on the phone, and I'm talking to you, and you hear a beep, right? Call waiting, right? Beep, beep, right? Someone's calling you, right? You could put me on hold and answer the call, yeah? Right? Some people don't, though. They just let it, someone's on hold. I hear the call waiting, call's coming in, right? As an example. But the call's waiting for me to answer. I can't answer my call in the computer world. Even if I hear the call waiting, signal coming through, if I'm using things synchronously, I'm going to wait, and I'm going to keep letting that call beep beep come up in my ear forever until I'm done my request, until I'm done my call. So if I'm in a call with Margot and I hear call waiting and I'm a synchronous server or a synchronous process, I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna ignore that call, and I'm just gonna finish our conversation. Right now, some people, that's how usually it should go nowadays, right? If I hear a call waiting, we go, hold on, Margot, let me get that call, right? That's asynchronous, where I can deal with Margot and I can deal with somebody else as well, right? Someone else. I can deal with as many calls as I want. I'm going to put you on hold for a second, get to the next one, and the next one, and the next one, all at the same time. It's almost like I can duplicate myself, right, in an asynchronous world, and I can answer all of you at the same time. In fact, I don't even have to put you on hold. All I'm doing is I'm just replicating myself to answer more and more calls. Okay, that's what asynchronous stuff does. That makes more sense. Well, it used to anyway. Okay, but in the new model, we don't use PHP anymore. Right? PHP is legacy stuff, legacy technology, right? That we stopped using, or we're using less and less these days. Sorry, there's lots of stuff out there. There's lots of PHP out there. So learning PHP is really important. PHP, ASP.NET, that's the other one that's out there that's really popular. For example, the Microsoft technologies that's out there is called ASP.NET. Right? That's the Microsoft side. Right? So we'll put that in there too. There's PHP. Right? Here's ASP.NET. That's kind of just traditional back-end stuff, right? PHP and ASP.NET. And PHP uses something called an AMP stack. Apache MySQL PHP is usually a typical stack that you follow. And the ASP.NET stack is usually something like C# on the back end with SQL Server, that kind of stuff that runs for ASP.NET. But now what we have is something new, or within the last few years anyway, which is Node. And Node, I'm just going to put this out there for you guys. So let's say Node.js. Node.js, what it does is it's another technology that's out there now that's becoming more and more popular these days. And it uses JavaScript, the stuff we've been using on the front end, on the back end, on the server side, right? And there's a call for doing this. And you might say, why, Tom? Why would I use JavaScript on the back end? JavaScript's front-end technology typically. And I would say, yes, it typically was for a while. But things have changed. Here's what would have to happen if you were going to do the traditional way of, programming the traditional way. You'd have to know HTML. So let's write these technologies down, right? But you'd have to kind of understand HTML, right? And then you'd have to kind of know, for sure, CSS, right? Because if you're without CSS, you couldn't do any kind of styling. So here's your CSS. That's another kind of language or process, if you will, right? So it's a scripting language too. So HTML, CSS. And you also have to know JavaScript, right? So here's JavaScript, because JavaScript is the stuff we use for interactivity on the front end, right? So JavaScript. Well, okay, I need to know those three if I'm a web developer. So this is, I definitely need to know. These are things if I'm a web developer nowadays, I still need to know these things. Let me not do that. I still need to know these things, right? Here we go. But I also need to know PHP or ASP.NET technology, C#, SQL, and a bunch of other stuff that I might need to know in addition to all this stuff, right? A lot of stuff you need to know as a web developer, right? Well, what if, and especially the database server being something like a SQL server, that's pretty typical, right? So I might have a database server being a SQL server, right? And now you have to know SQL language, right? So the SQL query language that you're going to be learning, you're going to have to learn that too, right? Well, what happens is they've got this new model, and we're going to be talking about this in server-side computing, but I want to give it to you now so you understand what it is when we start doing this stuff. Where we use something like a NoSQL server, right? And NoSQL typically is served in JavaScript. So we have a NoSQL server over here, right? As opposed to a SQL server, that's traditional, right? The old traditional ways of doing things. Make it a little fatter for us to house our little text. Yay. A SQL server or NoSQL server, right? And the NoSQL server uses JavaScript, and so does Node.js, and so does JavaScript. And so this way, you're using one homogeneous what we call full stack nowadays. Full stack before was Apache MySQL PHP, right? Full stack was also considered, ASP.NET with C# on the back end, an IIS server, and so on with JavaScript and HTML and CSS on the front end. Like, it's a lot of technologies, right? We're trying to simplify, and the only way we can do that is to continuously try and work with simplified technologies. And now, with the simplification comes this revolution in the way things are turning, and JavaScript in the back end is not easy. In order for you to be able to understand client-side or server-side technologies, you need to know client-side stuff really well. And that's what we're doing here in this course. We're teaching you JavaScript, enough JavaScript, so when you see the server-side stuff, you're like, oh, that makes sense. I understand how to do a function. I know how to do a variable. I know how to do an array. Because the same structures is what you're going to be using on the server side in modern web development. Okay, traditional web development, PHP, it's going to be there. It's always going to be there for the next, probably 10 years at least, more, because there's so much of it out there, right? So it's good to know that stuff. And again, it's another scripting language, right? So typically, you need to know, like, if you're going to, work as a developer where you do things like website revisions, right? Revising websites. You need to know a bunch of technologies, right? Well, slowly, that's becoming a little bit, it's changing, and as JavaScript is becoming more powerful. One of the problems that we had with JavaScript back in the day that didn't allow us to do server-side and stuff was that JavaScript had limitations. JavaScript wasn't fast enough back in the day. JavaScript was really slow. It was running on the server, and JavaScript was running on the client. So you have to depend on client technologies like the browser to really render the JavaScript, right? Whereas now, the browsers are lightning fast. They're much faster than they used to be. They use different engines than they used to do. And they use the power of the client, which is considerable these days compared to the server. In fact, some clients are just as powerful as the servers are, right? In that way. To render the page, right? So we can depend on the client hardware to do all the job that we need to do on the server side. So that's one thing. How about mobile? How does mobile fit in all this? Well, mobile, it kind of takes a step back. It doesn't have as a robust hardware signature. So, mobile is a little bit, lighter, I would say right now. And I'm saying a little bit lighter for what it needs to do. But eventually, let's face it, our little phones here are computers, right? So our little computers that we hold in our pockets are going to be powerful enough that it'll be seamless. Where I use a browser on the machine in front of me, whether I use my browser on my phone, the capabilities of my phone is going to come to the point where there's really little difference. And you might say, well, that's a long time coming or whatever. Not really. We're almost there. Like, really, think about what I have in my hand. I have a phone that's at least 1 or 2 gigabytes of memory. It was unheard of 10 years ago that I could have 2 gigabytes in my hand like this, right? With a processor that's capable of rendering things in 3D, right? Because I can run 3D games on my phone. I can do all kinds of crazy stuff if I wanted to, right? I can use it as a camera, as a video recorder, as my email client. I can play games with it. I can do whatever I want. It's a computer, right? If I have a computer in my hand, that means that the limitations that I would have had on the client side with JavaScript, again, from a phone perspective, are gone. I can do everything that on pretty much on the phone that I can do nowadays with a computer. So that's the kind of the model. And what we want to try and do up until this point, we were running things asynchronously all the time because PHP created copies of itself, if you will, a different process. It would keep on creating more and more processes or threads to handle different requests. But the new model, which we're going to see later, and I'm not going to talk too much more about it now, Node.js uses a single thread that it can run concurrently, right? Which is interesting. That's why Node.js is so popular. It actually runs it a lot faster than PHP or ASP.NET, right? In the right environment. Now, Node.js is not the right solution for all problems, right? We still might use PHP or ASP.NET technologies, for example, for certain problems. Same thing with SQL servers. A SQL server is a relational server. It has relations between one table and another, right? A NoSQL server has no relations. There's no relations at all. It's kind of almost like a flat file, right? And that's not kind of effective for every situation. Like, for example, if I'm using something like e-commerce, the model that I'm going to be using to connect to the server is going to be pretty heavy duty. There's going to be pretty much a structure for my model, right? So it may not make any sense for me to use a NoSQL server. So although Node.js is kind of on the rise, it's not the only solution that we're going to be using out there. Okay, that's my kind of intro into request response, Node, MVC, all that stuff. I want you to have heard the term MVC, Model View Controller. And if I'm going to test you on it, which I probably will, I'm probably going to ask you these questions. I'm going to probably say, what's the view? Where is the view? What does the view represent? Or where do I see the view? And the view is really rendered on the client machine, on the browser, right? The view is rendered as a result of a request that goes out to the server, gets processed, and comes back with a response that renders the screen, right? The processing might have something to do with the logic that we're going to use to connect through a model that we've created to communicate with the database server. And we're going to do a series of different steps: creation, reading, updating, and deletion of different parts of the server. We're going to get some data back from the server. It's going to do its little dance. It's going to kind of respond or restore all the data that we have on our view, right? So it's going to render that data. So model, view, and control, 3-tier applications is what we're going to do. We're doing here. And the other thing is that most modern applications can be broken up from a structure perspective. So I can have designers working on the view. I can have the back-end people working on the model, and somebody else working on the controller. Right? So I can have different teams of people working on different aspects of my application, and I can break it up through this MVC type of model. Okay, let's go back. Synchronous and asynchronous. And look what it says here: synchronous AJAX, not very common anymore because, but it's perfect. Use asynchronous, not synchronous, asynchronous AJAX to access the server over and over again. Okay, and look what it says here. You'll probably use this 99 of 100 times. It's totally true, right? Let's get to it though. What does the AJAX call look like? Well, here is what a XHR or XML HTTP request. That's what XHR stands for, right? That's what it looks like. We make a new XML HTTP request, and this is the new way of doing things. Now remember that if you have some older browsers like IE5 or IE6, XML HTTP request may not be supported and won't be supported in those old browsers. So there's a fallback that we have to use when we program our JavaScript so that it can detect if there's an older browser we're making the request with an older browser. Okay, let's structure our code. We've talked enough, right? Let's do a little bit of structure before we take a short break. All right, so I want to create some new files. I'm just going to minimize this stuff here, right? To set up our project for today, right? And what I want you guys to do, just to take you out of watch mode and take you into view mode, is I want you to look at the last thing we did together. We did this lesson 6, right? We went back to lesson 6. We did our midterm, but we did lesson 6. We went back in here. And what I want you to do is take lesson 6 and duplicate it. So I'm going to kind of duplicate lesson 6, right? You can also copy and paste it onto your desktop and rename it lesson 8. Okay, we're going to kind of take lesson 6 as some kind of template. I'm going to load up Visual Studio Code here, and I'm going to drag and drop lesson 8, the new one that I just made, into my Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to modify this in a second. Okay. One thing I need to do in order for me to create a new GitHub repository is I need to clean up my old Git folder, my invisible Git folder that exists for this file. So I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to go open in terminal. Let me just do that again. Open in terminal. I love when that happens. And in my terminal view, I'm looking at my COMP1073 lesson 8. I want to delete my GitHub on the Mac side or Linux. You do it like this: remove -rf.git. On a Windows machine, you go into the .git folder that's hidden, and you remove it from there. You just delete the .git folder, and now you have no repository for this file. This makes a few changes. So my readme.md file, it's not going to be lesson 6. It's going to be lesson 8. And let's add some more data in there. I'll say COMP1073 lesson 8 for client-side scripting at Georgia. And there's my file I'm using here. In my index.html, I'm going to also, if I have in my title, I'm going to change this to lesson 8 just to make sure that that's changed. So I'm making a couple of changes here in my files. And I'm going to save all, file save all. Oh, for Windows? Yeah, I'll do that after the break. I'll go through there and I'll show you how to do that, right? Because I have to launch my Visual first. You can if it's visible, right? You have to make you have to make your files, all hidden files and folders, visible in order for you to be able to delete it. If you don't have them visible, you can't see the .git file, .git folder, and then if you can't see it, you can't delete it. Right-click delete then, and that's all you need to do. Okay, so we've got our little file here, and I've got lesson 8, and this is kind of a review of what we did because you guys have been away for a week or so, 2 weeks. We haven't seen each other for a couple of weeks. So what should I do now if I'm making a new assignment? Right, so I've got my lesson 8, and I want to make my GitHub repository. I've got my here on my terminal. I'm going to initialize my Git repository with git init. That initializes my repository and creates that invisible.git folder, right? And then I'm going to do git add dot, which is going to add all my files to Git. That's what it's going to do. I've colored my terminal now, so it's maybe a little bit easier for you to see. You can also look over there. Maybe is it too small? Maybe it's too small for you guys. Maybe I can make it a little bit larger. What do you think? Let's see if I can do that. And we'll see the text in the file. It's 12-point Monaco. We'll change our font so that it's, I don't know, 14. Make it a little larger for you guys to all see that. 14 might be too big, but hey. How's that? Is that better? I can go higher. I can go 60. Let's do that. Doesn't matter to me, right? Let's go down to 16. Okay, they don't have a 16. I'll just type it in. 16. I want to make it clear for you guys, right? That's why I'm changing these things. Is that better now? How's that? 16. So git add dot, and then I want to do a git commit -m for message. That's what it stands for. Initial commit. Right, there we go. Press enter. I'm going to use the clear command. It's the same command as CLS on Windows. So clear. So I can start off. Now I'm ready to get to the next stage, and I need to connect my local repository with my remote repository. And guys, you've heard me say this at least 6 other times. You know, when we've created other things, every other class I've done this, right? But I'm doing it again just to remind you because we've been away. So let's go into GitHub, and I'm going to go to Georgian College, and I need to create a space for me to do this stuff with, right? So I'm going to get a new repository going here in Georgian College, and I'm going to go COMP1073. And that would be lesson 8. All right, lesson 8. And I'm going to click Create Repository. When I do that, it's going to give me a space and some script to use, which I'm going to copy and paste because I'm lazy, right? Back into GitHub, into my terminal. I'm just going to paste it and press Enter. When it does that, if I've set my GitHub up properly, it's going to take everything and populate it onto my GitHub website, right? My GitHub repo, cloud resource. Notice that I have my README file, and I have a simple initial commit that's set up here up on GitHub. Right? What I want to do, right, and what I ask you to do for this one is let's clear out some of this stuff. If we're going to make this work, I want to clear out some of the data that's in here. Right now, if you notice, I don't have much data in here. I only have something that says Welcome to Lesson 6. Ooh, that's an error. So I'll modify that. And I got my main container in here. And in my scripts, notice I have my scripts. I have Bootstrap and jQuery attached. Here's my app.js in the back end. And under my scripts, I have an app.js where I have some paragraph data that we're going to clean out. So I want you to take your app.js and just clean it out. So there's just the iffy that's left, right? So I get rid of all this stuff. And the only thing I want back that's left in here is the iffy, the immediately invoked function expression that we use as a container. And we used to also call this a closure, this structure, to close up or contain our data, right? And the reason for this is it creates a scope that's between this area here, the scope that comes from between this. And let me just put use strict. I'm going to move my use strict in here for a second. Okay. Use strict. Use strict is just a way of turning on strict mode so you get better errors from JavaScript. Okay, cool. So that's all I want you to put in there. So I wanted to update my app.js, which is inside my scripts. And that's another commit. That's a new feature that I've added. I've changed some stuff. And so now I can make another commit here. I'll do it here inside the app where I do something like updated app.js. And click this checkbox or checkmark. When I do that, and I click the ellipses and go push, it's got the same effect of me doing it here in the command line. All right, it's the same thing. If I look back online and if I refresh, this is all stuff you've seen before. You can see that I have a couple of places that it says updated app.js, and I also have now 2 commits right? If I click on my commits, I can see that there's more than one commit here that I've put up online. Yay. Very simple changes. Okay, I want to deploy to Azure, right? So remember how we did this last time. Here's a review. I'm going to go into Azure. So I'm going to go portal.azure.com. And hopefully it'll log me in with the right credentials. If it does not, I have to log out and go into incognito mode, right? So if I look at this thing, my directory, my default directory, it looks like it's me. I got a bunch of little apps going on. I have one from a previous lesson we did, which I may delete later on. But for now, I'm going to add another one. So I'm going to click the plus button. Normally I can hide or show this list of stuff we can do on Azure. I'm going to click plus here, and I'm going to go to web and mobile. And here I'm going to click on web app. And under the web app, I'm going to do this new app, which is going to be COMP1073. And it's going to be winter of 2016. And inside there, it's going to be lesson 8, right? Just to make it nice. Hey, as you go, for me, you're going to see DreamSpark if you've done it properly, right? DreamSpark. I'm going to leave it with the default resource group and the default service plan and click create. When I do this, my app isn't complete. All it does here is create the container for my app. So my container is created. I haven't put anything there. In order for me to deploy or transfer the data, all the files from GitHub to Azure so it works, I have to go into my settings, which I'm going to get to in a second. I got to wait till this is done, this deployment dance here that's going on. Let this thing finish. And when it's finished, I can go in there and do a continuous deployment. I can set up continuous deployment. I don't have to do this, the continuous deployment piece. I can only deploy once if I want, right? But it's more of a modern way of doing things. Okay, so I'm going to go down to my my publishing, and notice that it has, deployment source. I can choose my deployment source like I did last time. I'm going to choose, of course, GitHub. Here it is. You've seen this before, so this is all review. And I'm going to choose, what my account that I'm going to use. I'm going to use my Georgian account, right? And I'm also going to choose my project, which is the related project I have on there, which is COMP1073 Lesson 8, which is the GitHub project that I'm using to connect to, and also the master branch because I don't have multiple branches right now. I'm going to click OK, and if everything goes well, it's going to start doing this deployment service happening. The continuous deployment is going to happen right now. By the way, all these steps right now that I've done, all of them you should know how to do. If you don't know how to do any of these steps, and you're doing an assignment or something, this is where you can lose marks if you don't do one of these steps correctly, right? Because these steps in any assignment that I've given you are worth 8 marks. 4 marks for GitHub and from what I'm doing, and 4 marks for deploying to Azure or another cloud provider, all right? Okay, cool. It says successful here, but there's no check mark here. And I'm a kind of a nervous guy. I wait until the fetch is completed here inside Azure. And when I get my check mark, then I want to check my site. I want to do that beforehand because I want to give Azure a chance to, to create this new website for me, this new web location. And it's happening pretty quick. All I'm waiting for is the check mark. And as soon as the check mark's done, I'm going to go to check Azure and see if it works. Okay, it's done. Let's see what I've done if it works. I'm going to press Command or Control and click, which is going to populate my website in a different tab. I'm going to look through here and I see Welcome to Lesson 8. Okay, so that's what we should see. If you've done everything like the way I've done it, this is a great stopping place. We've got our little container that we're going to use for the rest of the day that we're going to use to create do some Ajax and everything else, and use some JSON data. So let's take a short break, 10 minutes or so, do a bit of a bio break, and when we come back, we'll continue.